And then this one. Okay, we're coming to the last two sections of Zechariah. So we should be done next week. And then we'll decide where to go from there for a while. These two sections are introduced in the same way, which we haven't met in the earlier chapters of the book. In Hebrew, it says Masa Davar Yahweh, literally translated oracle, word of Yahweh, or an oracle, a word of Yahweh. Clearly, we need some punctuation in English, but they have normally been referred to by the word Masa because this appears in other prophets as well, but this combination is quite unique to Zechariah. The word davar in Hebrew can mean word or thing. So davar Yahweh can mean a word from God, or it could mean a thing that God does. But when you attach masa to it, which normally means an oracle, as in a prophetic oracle, then it has a very singular meaning. Now, the first masa, or the first oracle, covers chapters 9, 10, and 11. The second masa covers the remaining chapters, 12, 13, and 14. So they're fairly even in length. Tonight, we will look at this first oracle. I put both the Hebrew and the English expression here because it's difficult to understand how the Hebrew is working, because this is a construction we don't find very often anywhere else. One of the first things we encounter as we enter the oracle is that there is a specific target for the oracle, for this one. We will look at the second oracle next week. We are told that the oracle is directed against the land of Hadrach, and then it names some cities in this land. And the moment we see the word Damascus and Hamath, we know this is referring to the area of the world known in Bible times as Aram. In modern days, it's known as Syria. So many of the modern Bibles have replaced Aram with Syria so that people can locate it in the modern map. So that's one of the targets of this oracle, Syria. Now remember that Syria was a deadly enemy of the northern kingdom of Israel when it existed, but to some extent also the kingdom of the south. In fact, sometimes Syria and Israel would join hands to attack Judah. And so Syria is always in the eyes of God. When you look at Bible history, Syria has always been one of the enemies of Israel. That whole region from ancient times. Interestingly, this was the region where Terah and his family first stopped and stayed after they moved from Ur. It's known in Genesis as Padan Aram, okay, literally the fields of Aram. And it is in Syria that God finally appears to Abraham and tells him to move on by himself to a new land that he will show, a land of promise. You know that when Jacob returned to Syria, running away from Esau, he lived with Laban, who was very antagonistic towards him. And God had to stop Laban from committing any harm against Jacob. Otherwise, the covenant was in jeopardy. So Aram, or modern Syria, that whole territory, has always been seen as an enemy of Israel in one way or another through history, and that has not changed even in modern times. This is a unique piece of history about the region, that certain of those territories were seen as enemies of Israel in biblical times, and they are still enemies of God even today. And then you have Lebanon, again naming the two dominant cities, Tyre and Sidon. Now, it was not called Lebanon in Bible times. It was in later Old Testament period became known as Phoenicia, or sometimes it was simply called Tyre and Sidon, the whole region. Modern day Lebanon, these are still dominant cities in modern day Lebanon. Now, the city of Beirut did not exist in Bible times. That would come in modern times. Okay, but Tyre and Sidon are still very much there. Now, Lebanon or Phoenicia had a mixed relationship with Israel. King Hiram of Tyre was the one who helped Solomon build the temple. He supplied most of the wood, he supplied the engineers, and so on for Solomon to build his temple. So, quite a contributor to the development of the monarchy in Israel. But after Solomon, this region, because it came largely under the control of Syria, also became one of the enemies. And in Ezekiel, Tyre became a symbol, the king of Tyre became a symbol of Satan himself. So it's a very extreme relationship that they had with Israel. Now, in today's context, Lebanon is still an enemy of Israel. That has not changed again. And then we have 3 cities that are mentioned here. They are quite prominent in the historical narratives of the Bible, particularly in the David narratives, Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ekron, also the Samson narratives. This is Philistine territory. They cover a current place we call Gaza, but the whole Philistine territory is about 3 times the size of modern Gaza. It's interesting that 2 of these names have carried on into modern times, Ashkelon and Gaza. Gaza is part of the Gaza Strip. Ashkelon is part of modern-day Israel. It's fairly close to the ancient city as well. Now, here's the thing about Philistine territory or the kingdom of Philistia. Well, the Philistines were never actually one kingdom. They were a federation of city-states, of small kingships. The Philistines were not Asians. The Bible says that they came from the island of Crete. According to archaeology and anthropology, they may have come even further west from Europe. They definitely were Europeans. Wall murals and so on of the Philistines show that they had different color eyes, they had lighter color hair, they were clearly Europeans. What is intriguing about Philistines is that they were Israel's #1 enemies from the time they resettled in the land until deep into the monarchy period. So if you were to look at the part of the world that is the most intransigent enemy of Israel, then it would have to be the area that we know even today as Gaza. Okay. The Philistines, in their wars against Israel, committed many of the same things that we see Hamas doing today. How much ancient Philistine history and knowledge influence Hamas's idea of warfare, we don't know. But I have a sneaking suspicion that some of those Hamas leaders are knowledgeable enough to adopt some of the tactics used by the Philistines. And the Israelites, no matter what they did, they could not really put down the Philistines. There were periods when they were able to suppress them, but never really got rid of them. And so history, as has been said, repeats itself. Well, in this region, these 3 areas, the Aram area, the Lebanon area, and the Philistine territory, these are seen as those enemies of Israel, perpetual enemies of Israel throughout biblical history. And so the prophecy here is quite interesting that it involves, in a way, through them to target any other nation that is an enemy of God's people. Whether you think of that in a purely spiritual sense, the way a lot of Adventists like to do, to escape physical realities, or in a more physical, political sense as the actual physical descendants of Abraham. But strangely, in Zechariah, you have the mention of Greece. as one of those territories targeted by this oracle. This is basically an oracle of judgment. The Hebrew name here is sons of Javan or Yavan. Sons of Yavan is well known, established archaeologically as referring to the Greek tribes. And this tells us that there was already contact in Old Testament times between Greece, probably the closest of the European nations, with Israel. And so it's not surprising that they are recorded here. Now, in Ezekiel's prophecies about that hyper alliance against Israel, Greece and all the East European nations are part of that alliance as well. And so it's quite intriguing to see how biblical prophecy, whether you look at it purely in a physical way or purely a spiritual way, tends to draw upon certain names over and over again. All right, so what happens in this oracle? The first thing we meet here is a prophecy that has been deemed messianic by Christians and is still deemed messianic by Jews as the prophecy about the coming king. In fact, it is cited in the Gospel of Matthew. And see, the moment you read this, you can remember it, but you probably remember the citation in Matthew versus the actual occurrence in Zechariah. Rejoice, people of Zion, shout in triumph, people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is humble, he's riding on a donkey's colt. This prophecy is cited almost verbatim in Matthew 21 at the triumphal entry of Jesus, that final entry marking the Passion Week. So we know it probably happened on a Sunday when Jesus rode into that city, and the Jews immediately recognized that he was claiming kingship. It was at that point that the Sanhedrin really turned antagonistic, particularly the priests, the Sadducees, turned antagonistic against Jesus because he dared to proclaim himself king, as if fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah, whom they believed would describe the appearance of the Messianic king when he arrives. Now, Matthew, in writing his gospel some 30 years after the event, takes that prophecy and tells us that the triumphal entry of Jesus is the fulfillment, the antitypical fulfillment of this prophecy of Zechariah. Now, what is interesting about Matthew's citation is that he actually cites Jeremiah. He tells us that it was Jeremiah who made this prophecy. This raises an interesting question. There is a similar but not so close prophecy in Jeremiah that talks about a donkey and so on. It is Zechariah that is the primary supplier. Now, did Matthew make a mistake? Did he miss that? It has raised a lot of questions in New Testament studies as to why Matthew referenced it wrongly. I don't think you reference it wrongly because the Jeremiah text also has an impact. So perhaps Jeremiah being a major prophet, that came to his mind and he put it there. But the prophecy comes from Zechariah, almost word for word, that he would come on a donkey, riding on a donkey's colt, which was a known practice of the Hebrew kings, the Israelite kings in the ancient world, starting with Saul. Okay, but they were not the only ones. There were other nations around them where this act of riding a colt, the idea of the colt is that nobody has ridden that colt before, and people don't normally ride donkeys in Bible times. The donkeys were labor animals. They were transportation, goods transportation material. Think of them like the trucks of our days, whereas horses are the cars of our days. So for a king to appear on a donkey is to reverse that interpretation of significance and importance. So that's why it says here that he's humble. He didn't come on a flashy horse, but rather a humble donkey. So for Christians, this has been seen, and it is even used in many Christian writings, Christian hymns and songs as the image of or proof that Jesus was the Messiah. And it seemed that Jesus entered Jerusalem deliberately this way. And so when he was challenged, "Are you the king?" by Pilate, he doesn't really answer Pilate. He just says, "Well, that's what you're saying. That's what everybody's saying." He doesn't say really yes or no, kind of uh, ambiguity involved in his answer. But I think the Jews understood, particularly the priesthood, whose livelihood depended on a very strong alliance with the Roman crown. And so they turned against Jesus during this week. Many people think that the Pharisees were Jesus' number one enemies. No, they were his number one critics. It was the Sadducees who initiated the whole process of trying to get rid of Jesus. In fact, we know that several Pharisees had already become secret disciples and weren't even involved in that final Sanhedrin. So here's a very clear link between Zechariah and the New Testament applied to Christ. To modern day Jews, this is still a messianic prophecy, but looking forward to the coming Messiah, who for them is still in the future. Now, embedded in this oracle, the judgment against these nations who are traditional enemies of Israel, the appearance of this messianic king, because this is all about his kingdom, but it does raise a question: what will be the status of Israel? So this new king comes, this messianic king has arrived. These enemy nations are going to be judged and destroyed. But what happens to Israel herself? Well, we are told that this king will usher in a period of peace and prosperity. Now, you know that Jesus, fulfilling this messianic picture, did not bring peace and prosperity in a physical way to his followers. It would take a long time. They would live through centuries of persecution and so on. How beautiful, how wonderful they will be. Young men will thrive on abundant grain. Young women will flourish on new wine. It paints a picture that is similar to the report of the 12 spies when Moses had sent them into the land. That this is a rich land, this is an abundant land, but which had become largely unused during the years that they were in exile. It had turned into semi-arid, most of the land. There is evidence that the whole of the land of Israel was rich, fertile land, but slowly, bit by bit, through neglect, through dislocation of people, the diaspora of the people of Israel, the land became more and more arid. And so the restoration here is almost symptomatic of a new world, a new life. So that's one of the things that will happen to the Jews. The second thing is that all their prisoners will be freed. This is very important to modern day Jews who actually know their Bible, considering what has happened since October 7. And the promise is made that I will free your prisoners. Now, what's interesting at the time of this prophecy is that there were no Jews anywhere in the Persian Empire who were prisoners. The Jews had been granted their freedom. Yes, many of them did not return to the land. Many stayed in the diaspora. Many of them had settled in Egypt, those who were not taken to exile by Nebuchadnezzar. So the idea, even to the readers of Zechariah, seems to be applied at a more metaphoric level, if not literal, because there were very few Jews or remnants of Israel anywhere in the world at the time of Zechariah who were literally prisoners. Unlike, say, when they were in Egypt or under Babylonian rule, where they were highly restricted, or under Assyrian rule. Under the Persians, they had total freedom. The anomaly of history is that in Bible times, Persia was the protector of Israel more than once in history. In modern times, Persia is the one that wants to destroy Israel. It's like history has turned upside down. The clock of time has been reversed. So here we have two very physical looking promises, peace and prosperity, words that are being used so much today by everybody who's trying to find some kind of stability in the Middle East, and then prisoners being freed. Now, this motif of freed prisoners is found in all the prophets, started with Isaiah and Jeremiah, Amos, Ezekiel, Hosea. It's a common theme. And Jesus would cite a text from Isaiah that includes this idea of freeing prisoners. It gave birth to one of the most important 20th century Christian theologies that was born in Brazil, known as liberation theology. During the heyday of dictatorships in South America, particularly Turkey, Argentina, and so on, a Catholic monk got it into his head that there can be no freedom in Christ if there is no political freedom. So he launched a theology that became known in the world as liberation theology, the most influential theology birthed during the 20th century. And today, most Asian theologians and South American theologians are by and large subscribers to liberation theology. Now, for the South Americans, liberation theology means literally liberation, even physically. The movers of the movement actually taught that it is a Christian duty to pick up arms and to fight and overthrow a government that is ungodly, not just with words and martyrdom. Okay, a kind of a Catholic jihad, if you like, against evil governments. Now, many people have not recognized this, but liberation theology had a great deal in pushing South America away from dictatorships. You know, after the Second World War, until about the 70s or so, South America is nothing but a bunch of dictator countries, especially the big influential ones. Liberation theology played a big part in pushing that continent more towards freedom and democracy. Now, what's interesting about South America is that the entire continent is solidly Christian. It's the most Christian continent in the world. And yet it's the one that has some of the highest crime rate cities in the world. It's the one that is the most famous in terms of the drug trade. Some of the greatest evil dictatorships that we have seen in the world have come in South America. This is interesting that where Christianity set foot and conquered an entire continent, that continent turned the most evil for an extended period of time. And it took a revolution, a theological revolution with political aims and so on that helped to overthrow that life in South America. Now, there are still many people around the world who are prisoners, whether they're prisoners of war, prisoners of conscience, political prisoners. There's hardly a country in the world today that you can say there are no political prisoners. There are no prisoners because of their religious convictions. So this is a very important motif in the prophets and in the Messianic kingdom, the freedom of prisoners. Thirdly, the prophecy says, the oracle says that Israel would become weapons in the hands of God. It's very descriptive. Judah is my bow, Israel is my arrow, Jerusalem is my sword. Now, it's interesting that these same weapons are pictured in Revelation 19 in relationship to Christ and his final conquest. So there is some kind of echo of this picture in Revelation 19 about the final war that Jesus will fight. And then there is a guarantee given of victory and protection. Yahweh Sabaoth will protect his people and they will defeat their enemies. You can see why there is this innate belief in the Jews of today, since the Zionist movement, that they cannot really be defeated. Yes, they may be suppressed, they may be dispersed, but they cannot be completely defeated. Now, for us who are part of the greater Israel, the metro Israel, the spiritual Israel, the thought is equally important, because end time prophecies of the Bible says that the world will eventually turn its attention to God's people. All those who claim the name of this God in one form or another, regardless of the formal affiliations they may seem to have at the moment, they will come under the same evil persecution that the early Christians did. And it's very interesting to see that the motif, the concept of freedom is accompanied by this realization that they will be attacked, there will be wars, but they will be victorious. When you look at the songs in the book of Revelation, most of them are what we call victory chants. They are chanting the victory that Christ brings. And remember that Revelation speaks about three cosmic wars: the war in heaven, Armageddon, and the final battle of Gog and Magog. And the redeemed from the earth are described as those who are victorious. In the messages to the seven churches, at the end of each letter comes these words: to him who is victorious, I will give this. And there are 7 different promises that Jesus makes to his church. So it's a common theme in the Bible, the victory of God's people. Chapter 10 is a different tone altogether, even though it's still part of the oracle. Chapter 10 talks about the restoration of Israel, along the same lines that you meet in Isaiah chapters 60 to 62, and in the book of Amos, in Ezekiel, the whole, nearly half of Ezekiel towards the end. But there's some intriguing elements here which are stated a little differently from those other books. One of them, which I have kind of played around with terminologies because of the world we live in, is the promise of climate control. So one of the things about our world is that we have absolutely no control over the climate. And right now, the climate, largely accelerated by human action, seems to be running amok. It's gone awry. Everything is not where it's supposed to be. The predictions for 2024 hurricane season is that it will be the most intense hurricane season on record. Southeast Asia and much of Asia are waiting the heavy rains that supposedly will be brought by another La Nina, which will be worse than any La Nina that we have seen in history. South Asia has already been hit by a big cyclone. And we have hot weather when it's supposed to be cooler, and dry weather when it's supposed to be rainy. Part of the restoration is that the climate will be brought under control. And it's put in a very interesting way. Ask the Lord for rain in spring, for he makes the storm clouds. And he will send showers of rain, so every field becomes a lush pasture. Now you have to travel through Israel to understand the meaning of this. Most of Israel, modern Israel, the southern part in particular, even in Bible times, gets very little rain. And so agriculture, until the modern state of Israel found technological ways to do agriculture, was very difficult. Galilee was watered because of the snow and the water that is present on Mount Hermon, flowing down through many rivulets and rivers. But as you get further south, it gets drier and drier until you hit the Sinai and it's just bone dry. I don't think it ever even rains at the Sinai. But who knows? You've seen the recent massive rains and flooding in Dubai, in the UAE. So that dry part of the world may be turning into a monsoon part of the world. We don't know. The promise here is that God will ensure that they have the right climate at the right time to grow their crops, so that their fields will be lush with pasture, so their animal industry will benefit from it. Remember what the 12 spies, how they describe the land of Israel or the land of Canaan? A land flowing with milk and honey. Milk is a metonymy for animal farming, and honey is a metonymy for fruit farming. The word actually is not honey as we think. It's talking about fruit puree. Okay. And so they're being told that the earth will be recreated. The land will be back the way it was. And then there's an intriguing addition here that God is going to punish the false shepherds. Now, the identification is quite straightforward. Those who are leaders but who fail the mission of God, who fail to lead their people or led them into the wrong path, they are going to be punished by God. This language of leaders of Israel as shepherds is common in the Bible. It's also a common profession among the chosen of God. Abraham was a shepherd, Isaac and Jacob were shepherds, Judah was a shepherd, Moses was a shepherd, Amos was a shepherd. Isaiah was not a shepherd, but he talked a lot about shepherding as part of the work of the Messiah. And same here with Zechariah. Okay, also Ezekiel and others. And when Jesus came, the Gospel of John is full of discussion about shepherd. Jesus would tell parables about shepherds. My anger burns against your shepherds. I will punish these leaders. They have failed. They led the people astray. They did not care for the people by practicing injustice, discrimination, bribery. They perverted the Torah, making themselves rich. Now, Jesus said the same thing in those two cleansing moments recorded in the Gospels at the temple. My house should be the house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. Now, students of the Bible get this picture that the most corrupt people at the time of Jesus were the tax collectors. We know they were pretty corrupt. They made a lot of money. But they were nothing compared to the corruption of the priesthood. This did not really hit me until my second visit to Israel. Got to go underground to the 2,000-year-old street-level city being excavated, the actual city of Jesus. Modern-day Jerusalem and its streets, they are about 2, 3, 5 meters above the excavation points below. Okay, and one of those main streets in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus has been excavated. And in the excavation, they discovered the house of a priest. Now, the opulence and the luxury of that house just blew my mind. Now, I've read in historical books about how the priests really made so much money, tons of money, by manipulating the worship system and by currying favor with the Roman emperors and so on. But seeing that excavation and then the model reconstruction of it, I'm like, man, if I had one of these houses in today's world, you would be considered the rich and famous. So Jesus was a real thorn in the flesh for the priesthood, because they were the spiritual, holy shepherds, but they were absolutely corrupt. Now, we know that the priesthood had moments of corruption all the way back to the time of Aaron himself. They were supposed to be perfect men spiritually and physically, but many of them were not able to live up to that calling. and found ways of making money, even more so, corrupting the system of worship to make money for themselves. And this is why they are included, because when looking at the fate of the people of Israel, they were just as bad as those enemies, those enemy nations that came against God's people. So God is going to punish these evil shepherds or these false shepherds. And then the promise that is repeated in every single prophet, God will bring his people home. In Old Testament studies, this is known as the theology of the gathering, that God will bring his people home. I don't know if you've ever watched migratory birds, but it's quite an awesome sight. You know, when an entire flock of geese are flying together, heading for their spawning grounds. But I think one of the most amazing migrations is the migration of the salmon fish, where they will go back to the place where they were born, where the eggs were laid by their forefathers, in order to lay their eggs. They return home. For Israel, by the time of Zechariah, Israel, or the Jewish people, were spread out all the way from Morocco to India, all the way into Russia and Turkey and deep into Ethiopia and so on. Many had also migrated into the Arabian Peninsula and this area. They were literally everywhere. You see, the freedom that the Persians gave them enabled them to move about. And so they did. They have been a restless people. Besides the punishment of God, that they were driven out of their land. But here's the promise, the ultimate promise God made to Abraham's descendants, the gathering. He will bring them home. I will strengthen Judah and save Israel, he says. When I whistle to them, they will come running. I have redeemed them. I don't know if Baki remembers this, but when we were kids living in Cherrapunji, the way my father would summon us, no matter where we were in the village, playing with other kids and whatever, is by whistling. And when you hear that whistle, you must run home. Okay. This is a beautiful picture that is given here, like a father giving his special whistling code that his children can recognize no matter where they are, and they will come flocking back to the land, to their home. They and their children will survive and return again to Israel. I will bring them back from Egypt, that's way down to the south, and gather them from Assyria, so that's the Shinar, the Babylonian captivity. In other words, from the north to the south, or from the south to the north, he will bring them back. In other prophets, we read from the east to the west. We'll bring from all over. This is a tremendous promise. It was enshrined in law in the modern state of Israel as a concept for the very existence of a Jewish state, and that is the gathering. By my power, this is a repetition from chapter 4, I will make my people strong, and by my authority they will go wherever they wish. Now, I think the ultimate fulfillment of this particular promise is the New Jerusalem and the new heavens and the new earth. Because at the second coming of Christ, all of God's people will be gathered together. Now, Christians love to think of heaven as home, but the Bible never says heaven is home. Heaven is just a very nice long vacation time, and a working vacation at that, if we understand Revelation 20 properly. But then we will all come back, all of his people, all of God's children, physical, spiritual Israel, whatever terminology you want to use, they will all be gathered. Now, my conviction is that there will be billions of people in that gathering, in that New Jerusalem, who did not know Jesus in their lifetimes. And this is just to pique your interest, because in the second oracle, we actually discover evidence of how people will be in the kingdom of this Messiah, but never heard of him in their lifetimes. Okay, so we will cover that next week as we wind up Zechariah. So he will bring his people, he will establish them. Amos says that when they are established in the land, they will never be uprooted again. And that's a similar promise here. They would have the freedom of the land. And in the cosmic sense, I'd like to think of it the freedom of the universe. One of my great dreams in life is to someday be able to travel to all the different stars, and with sin gone out of the universe, in that recreated universe of God, we will be able to visit all of the worlds, all of the stars, all of the beings. We will not be limited or bound to this planet. It was sin that bound us on this planet, and therefore that will be removed. That bond, those shackles, the chains will be gone, and God's people will be able to go. Remember what Jesus promised, one of his final promises to the disciples: I'm going away, but I'm going to prepare a place for you. The place is not heaven, by the way. The place is a reference to the New Jerusalem. And I will return for you, so you will be with me where I am. And then that grand introduction of how the New Jerusalem, as the bride of Christ, will descend from heaven, having all of the redeemed. In Revelation 7:4-19, we meet pictures of these redeemed from everywhere in the world, from every nation, tribe, language, people, race, and so on, in kingdom of the Messiah. Now, chapter 13, surprisingly, begins with a short dirge. We can see this is dirge by the language. The word weep is used 3 times, and the dirge is against these nations that are being destroyed by God, against Lebanon. But the target in the dirge are the trees, so the cedars of Lebanon, the cypress trees of Lebanon. Lebanon was famous for this type of trees. Bashan was used by Amos earlier in reference to the northern kingdom, or that central part of the land. The oaks of Bashan. Oaks are very, very strong wood, lasts almost forever. And then the forest, the thickets of the Jordan Valley. Okay, the Jordan Valley is not like the Euphrates or the Nile. It's covered with trees that are growing. So when the psalmist wrote about tree by a river, he's looking at the Jordan River. Even today, Jordan River has a lot of trees growing onto it, almost like a canopy as you go through the river. Today, of course, you cannot do any water sport on the River Jordan. Nobody is allowed in the River Jordan except for one particular spot where Christians are allowed to do baptism. It's quite an interesting relationship that modern Israel has with that particular river. And then the rest of the oracle comes back to this good and evil shepherds concept. And you will see how John took this concept, blended it with Ezekiel and so on, and came up with the understanding of Jesus as the good shepherd. The good shepherd cares for the flock. And this time, Zechariah is being depicted as doing that function. And then he tells us that he performed some symbolic action the way that Ezekiel was so famous in doing. That he took 2 shepherd staff. Nobody would have 2 staff. He gave them names. One was called Favor, the other one was called Union. And then he says that he got rid of 3 evil shepherds in a single month. We don't know who he's referring to, whether there were 3 other leaders among those exiles who were really standing up against the plan of God. We are not sure. Or if this is proleptic, he's talking about the Messianic king who will do this. And he says that he took one staff, the one called Favor, cut it in 2, and says this is what will happen. God will no longer honor the covenant with the nations. So the nations either be part of Israel or they're not part of God's kingdom at all. And then comes a prophecy that is taken as messianic by the New Testament. But it's a little bit different in Zechariah, and it's a little different in in the Gospels. This concerns the wages, which is 30 pieces of silver, and that these are thrown away to the potter, which the Gospels call it the potter's field. And these were thrown to the potter in the temple of the Lord. Something similar to what Judas Iscariot did. Remember, he was paid 30 pieces of silver, and then he has this change of heart. He comes back to the Sanhedrin, the priests who were probably at the temple area, and he throws the money at them, saying that, I have betrayed innocence. I'm at fault. And then, of course, you know what Judas did. He went and hung himself, and the land where he died was bought with this 30 pieces of silver and became known as the potter's field. And so you've got all this mashup of ideas. In Zechariah, this is payment for wages. Think of it like salary, which he simply threw away. In Matthew, the fulfillment is a little bit different, and this is always true with typology, that the format always changes, the concept is the same. He was paid not as a salary, he was paid to betray Jesus, and then he throws and returns the money, and it is used to buy a place to bury him. Then he talks about the second staff, which is called union, that it is cut in two, showing that the bond between Judah and Israel, that means the two kingdoms, is broken. By this stage, the two kingdoms no longer existed. It was only Judah that really existed. Now, we have evidence that there were people from the other tribes who were absorbed into this larger thing. By this time, Israel had become the Jews. When they came back from Persia, the word Jews is derived from the term Judah, which in Hebrew is Yehudi, and in Persian it became Jew. Okay, so the identity of Abraham's descendants had undergone a transformation from Israel to Yehudi, to Judah. And so this is probably a reminder of that fact, that what we have now is one single identity, but it's a new identity for them. Then the Lord said to me, go and play a part of the worthless shepherds. Go around and act like these worthless shepherds so people will understand what this is all about. Kind of a strange thing to ask him to do, but he did that with Ezekiel as well, to do strange things that probably drove people crazy. And then he was to show that the ending of these blind shepherds, of these worthless shepherds, would be blindness. Okay. Notice what it says here. I will cut his arm and pierce his right eye. He will be paralyzed on one side. Not a very happy description. God is like saying, if you are doing like this, then I will cut off your arm, cut off your eye. So you become a useless, handicapped, paralyzed. I believe that Jesus probably drew inspiration from this when he says it is better for you to cut out your eye to avoid sin than have both eyes and end up in hell. It is better for you to cut off your arm than to go into hell with both arms. So you can see that Zechariah is quite influential to the New Testament, to the Gospels, but also in Revelation. Now, in John chapter 10, which is a parallel passage to Zechariah 11, Jesus differentiates himself as the good shepherd from the false shepherds. And the main differentiation is this, that the good shepherd is willing to cut off his arm and his eye, to give up his life for the sheep. The false shepherds do it for money. So as the previous slide shows, and therefore they do not serve the people of God. And that brings us to the end of this first oracle. Now, since this is a pair of oracles, we kind of have to wait for the final oracle to see the full picture. So what do we see here? God's judgment against all the enemies of Israel, the appearance of this messianic king, the restoration of the land and the gathering of the people, and God striking the evil leaders even among his own people. And so we will complete that with a beautiful picture of the messianic kingdom and who might be in it and who could possibly enter in the next oracle. And so that brings us to the end of Oracle 1. Next week is Oracle 2, and that's the end of the book as well. All right, let me stop the recording.